My name's Matt Stanbury. I work for Advanced Energy Economy. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a multi-technology trade association, business association. So we work on behalf of all the technologies and services around the country that are designed to make our energy system more secure, clean, and affordable. So that includes, in large part, demand response, energy efficiency, renewable energy, high efficiency natural gas plays in our space as well. All of the smart grid technologies play as well. So for about the last year and a half, we have had a major campaign on behalf of our businesses, led by our businesses really, by our members, dealing with EPA's upcoming regulation around greenhouse gases from the existing power sector. And so my job is to distill for you today into a little 101 here on what the Clean Power Plan is. I'll tell you a little bit about how we feel about EPA's proposal. But actually, most of this is going to be informational about what is this thing. So it's a 2,000-page piece of reg. So it's a lot to get your arms around, and I'm going to try and do my best to sort of simplify it for you. So I think it's important as we look at this regulation to understand that what's called the Clean Power Plan. So that's what EPA has put out as a proposal for regulating CO2 emissions from the existing power sector does not come from a vacuum, right? So really what is happening here is EPA is on, we're sort of on the arc of history as it relates to CO2 emission regulations across our entire economy. And that story really begins back in 2007. I'm not going to go through all these details, but it starts with the Supreme Court decision finding that greenhouse gases are a pollutant with health and welfare impacts. And then ever since then, EPA, and essentially giving EPA the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act, ever since then, EPA simply, in pretty basic language, taking all the regulatory steps that they need to regulate GHGs from all of the relevant emitting sectors of the economy. So they started that really with the mobile sector in 2012, and now they've, actually before 2012, that was back in 2011, then they got to the power sector in 2012. When EPA thinks of the power sector, they roughly divide it into two groups. The first being new sources, that's basically everything that hasn't been built yet, and existing sources, which is the existing system. And so they came out with a proposal in 2012 around new sources. They're still finalizing that reg now. And then they are now, then what we're here to talk about today, put out a proposal in the summer of last year for regulating existing sources. Okay. So with that quick history, now let's look forward dealing just with the existing source rule. What kind of time frame are we on here for regulation of the existing power sector? So EPA put out that proposal in June of last year. They took comments on it for a long time. They got 4 million comments. So they gave lots of people lots of time to do that because there was so much interest. So they actually extended the period to December of last year. Normal time frame, just for reference, is 60 days. So they made it quite long. And then what's coming out will be a final proposal. It was scheduled for June. Looks like it may get pushed a little bit back from that, probably not too far. Midsummer, we're expecting a final rule here. And then states. So this is the way the Clean Air Act works here. This is under Section 111D, as in dog, of the Clean Air Act. The way this works is it's a joint federal-state process. So the feds basically set out stringency and timeline. That, in very simple language, that's what they're doing, setting targets for the states. And then the states are actually the ones tasked with developing the plans to actually hit those targets. So the states have 13 months, essentially. We'll see if this timeline adjusts a little bit because the EPA is going to be a little delayed on the final rule submission. But they'll have about 13 months to develop a plan. And then EPA will review those plans. And by the way, states can request an extension. There are two different types of extensions, and I'll tell you, it's actually a pretty high bar to get an extension. You actually have to basically do all of the work with none of the credit. So you have to make your whole plan, highlight a section, say, I can't do this for X, Y, and Z reason, I can't finalize this, can I get an extension? So you've basically gone through the process of developing the whole plan, except for whatever piece you're missing. And then EPA decides yes or no. And so if you do get an extension, if you're working with other states, you can get a 2-year extension. If you're working alone, you can get a 1-year extension. Okay, so that's the process that we're on. All right, so now what the heck is this thing? So like I said, it's a big rulemaking. So I think we like to break it down into kind of a simplistic framework, right? So there's essentially two parts to this thing. There's front end and back end. So front end is all about setting the state emission targets. Like I said, EPA is basically setting targets for emission reduction for the states. And the second is rules, this is the back end, is about rules that EPA is putting out to tell states what's allowed as they develop their plans. So those are the front end and the back end. I'll address those sequentially in the coming slides. So on the front end, a couple things to know. So the way the Clean Air Act is structured, EPA can't just willy-nilly pick a target. It's not possible. They have to go through a process evaluating technology availability, costs, whole energy system requirements, all these factors in setting what's called the best system of emission reduction, right? And so they evaluate resources on a state-by-state basis and try to determine a reasonable amount of emission reduction. People debate reasonable all the time, by the way. That's probably the source of 90% of the debate in not only in Washington but in all the states. But it's important to know that they can't just pick a number. That they actually have to develop out a methodology for coming to numbers. Okay, so that's the best system of emission reduction. And the other thing to know about that is the way this is done is on the basis of emission rates. What the heck does that mean? Well, a rate is pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. So you might be more familiar with just straight pounds. So that would be something that might be more familiar from like a cap and trade system, something like that, where you have a total emission budget. Well, that's not how the Clean Air Act is written. The Clean Air Act is written as an emission rate standard. I'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. I should note that EPA is allowed, some states have basically said they want to use a mass-based system instead, and EPA is actually allowing that, basically a conversion. Basically they say, we'll do the math for you, what that means, how you can basically translate from one to another. But the thing to know is this is set as an emission rate standard. Okay, and then the other thing is that you'll hear, and this is, I just want to, there are some common misperceptions out there that I just want folks to know. So people say, or actually EPA estimates that this rule, if implemented as they propose, would reduce national emissions 30% from 2005 levels by 2030. Well, that's just that's an estimate. There's nothing binding about that, right? What's binding are the emission rate levels that they set for the states. This is a modeling result that they say, well, we'll assume X for economic growth and other factors, and we determine that these emission rates that we're setting we think are going to reduce emissions by 30%. So just something to know. And then on the back end, a couple of things to know. There are two compliance periods. The first is 2020 to 2029, and the final period is 2030 to 2032. The way these work is states actually have to meet an average emission rate target over that period. So you're actually taking average emissions over the period. That's what you're actually targeting. It's not a year-by-year compliance. So in that interim compliance, you've got to hit an average target over that whole period. Okay, then on the back end, the EPA, and I'll show you what I mean by this, has given states actually quite a bit of flexibility in what they can put forward in their plans. And one of the forms of flexibility is they've allowed states to go regional if they want to. Okay, so what's this PSER thing? That basically, how does EPA try to determine the emission rate targets? Don't worry, I'm not going into the calculus of it and all of its gory detail, but I just want to give you the high level vision for what they did. So they basically said, okay, let's take 2012 emission rates from all of the regulated emitting sources. These are all your power generators, right? Of a certain size. They're roughly over 25 megawatts. And we're going to average those, okay, and that's a starting point. And then we're going to estimate resources for emission reduction that are reasonable in EPA's view, and on a state-by-state basis, and we'll use that to come up with a final rate for the interim period and then the final period. Okay, so what are these resources that they use? So they basically broke it into 4 blocks. There's the first block is basically improvements to coal plants, existing coal plants, heat rate improvements. The second is block 2. It's really about redispatch. So basically taking the existing set of natural gas combined cycle plants that are on the system, maybe not running at full capacity. Often they've been used on the margin. So they run at low capacity factors, often depends on the state. And indeed the time of the year. But in general, there is a big fleet of gas plants that are run at relatively low capacity factors around the country. And they say, well, if those get ramped up and coal plants get ramped down, there's an emission reduction from that resource. Then block 3, they look at zero emission generators. So they look at, there are 2 kinds of those. There's the nuclear kind and there's the renewable kind. And then they look at the demand side, which is your energy efficiency, demand response, et cetera. Okay, so all of that, they add up all those resources, they take that starting 2012, and then they come up with your emission rate target. Okay, so they're evaluating state-by-state resources, so what happens? You get a lot of differentials. The colors are a little faded here, but you can see different colors. So this is representing the emission rate reductions required in the states. Okay, so you see big differentials, and actually Pennsylvania here circled at 479 is in the middle of the pack in terms of the emission rate reductions required. So lots of conversation about this. I'll note that again a little later. All right, so now let's think about the sort of back end, right? So that was the front end, setting the standards. Now the back end. What's EPA sort of laying out for states on the compliance side? All right, so states have to submit a compliance plan to EPA. And basically in that plan, they have to lay out policies that they believe are going to get the state to the emission rate targets that have been set for them. Well, they can't just say, well, trust me. They actually have to show why they think that the policies are going to result in emission reductions that have been laid out. And they have to basically go through and do power sector modeling to show it. And so EPA evaluates whether they think that modeling is accurate and whether the sort of suite of policies that the state puts forward will meet the emission reduction. And then the EPA has a year to do evaluations. Notice they're going to open each plan up for notice and comment around the country. This is 50 of them for public comment. So that's a lot of public comments. So just to note it. So Pennsylvania will go through its process to develop a plan and take whatever stakeholder inputs are they want to and are legally required to. But then the feds will also take stakeholder input as well as they're evaluating the plan. And then EPA can either reject the plan, obviously accept the plan, or they can do a partial. So they can say, this looks good, except this one element's not going to work. And for the portions, if they've rejected the whole thing or if they've rejected part of it, they can put a federal plan in place instead. And once that's in place, once the state's plan has been accepted, that initial plan becomes a benchmark. There's a no backsliding provision. Once that's set, the states have to do that or better going forward. Okay. So what I mean by states have lots of flexibility here. So the states actually, so I mentioned all those building blocks. Just forget them. EPA's basically said, you show us what technologies, policies you want to put forward for emission reduction. We've obviously identified some resources in these blocks, but forget them. You can propose what you want. And you obviously have to show us why you think they're going to work. And if we come to the same conclusion that they're going to work, we'll accept them. So they've laid out a non-exclusive list of compliance actions. These are like technology areas, renewables, efficiency, et cetera. But they said propose other ones. And then they did the same on policies. They laid out some policies that they said can result in emission reductions, RPS, EERS, et cetera. But they said you can propose other ones. So a couple other forms of flexibility in this. The states, as I mentioned, can actually convert their emission rate target to a mass-based target. There's some efficiency that some folks will talk about that can come from doing that. Basically, it's easier to count some things when you do a mass-based system. And states can also join into a regional effort, which a lot of modeling shows is a more cost-effective approach to doing this, although there's obviously complexity logistically to set up regional options. So just a couple of buckets of things that are sort of hot areas of discussion around the plan. So regional compliance is one. There's been a bunch of different analyses being done, active conversation amongst the states. The states are sort of, in general, we're working, by the way, in a lot of different states. So I work federally, but also with partners in the states like KIA. We're working in 9 different states and actually at a lower level in another 14 states on top of that. So we get a pretty good exposure working everywhere from Texas to Pennsylvania to Michigan and some other places out west. So pretty good range of opinions on this. So I'd say, a lot of the states are saying this developing a plan takes some time. We need to figure out how to do it for ourselves first. And then we do see some value in this regional thing. It's great if others can do some modeling to kind of show us how to do it. So that's one area of conversation. There's a lot of conversation around, I noted the differential across the states and the targets. There's been some equity conversations around that. So that the state target differentials are an area of discussion. Also the federal plan, how EPA is going to lay out a basic model for a federal plan. They can kind of go one of two ways. They could lay out a pretty draconian federal plan, which they could use to kind of really encourage states to develop their own plans. Or they could lay out kind of more of a carrot approach of, hey, these are a bunch of different approaches that you could take that we would find acceptable if you want to put them into a state plan. We don't know which way they'll go, but that's an area of conversation. And they'll actually make a proposal on that, and then there will be a comment period on that. We're expecting that midsummer, that proposal. Then reliability has been a hot topic. Maintaining a reliable energy system is obviously everybody agrees that that's a priority. There's been some good analysis. We actually just did an analysis with Rattle Group, which is a big energy modeling firm around this topic. And then the last is the reduction timeline. And sort of how fast do states need to reduce their emissions over time, and what's reasonable, and that's an area of debate. Okay, so quick reactions from our business perspective. So as we're looking at the framework, we actually like the flexibility that EPA put in. So we take positions on policy developments where there's market potential for our businesses, and this is one of those. So this is a reg that our businesses care about a lot. And basically the fact that EPA sort of went beyond the fence line of traditional power plants to look for emission reduction opportunities, we like a whole lot because they're really cost effective, and frankly our businesses provide those. Whether they're renewable energy plants or energy efficiency measures, they're all things that are beyond the fence line of a traditional power plant. But are really actually pretty cost-effective resources for emission reduction. And the other thing is that they provide a bunch of other benefits. They're not actually, I mean, if you look at VR is a great example, right? Demand response is not an emission, it's not designed as emission reduction technology, it's designed as a reliability tool. But it provides emission reduction. So there are a lot, and you can look at, we have a really broad technology spectrum. You can look at all of these technologies. They all provide a bunch of different benefits. They also happen to provide emission reductions too. So the fact that this is a flexible system, we like, because it allows states to use technologies that are cost effective and provide multiple kinds of benefits simultaneously. Because we're also aware that our energy system, as Maureen was alluding to before, is facing sort of a host of different challenges that it's dealing with. EPA regs are one thing, and there are some other EPA regs that are important in the conversation, but we're also seeing changing customer demands as we're moving into our, continue to move further and further into our information society. And we're seeing some basic infrastructure aging issues arise in our system, and some underinvestment issues arise. And so there are a bunch of these challenges that a number of these technologies address sort of simultaneously. So we like the flexible framework. No surprise we have quibbles, as I noted at the bottom. I won't bore you with those. There are a bunch of things that we think EPA could have done better, and we've issued reams of comments to the agency on that point. Internally, interestingly, just to give you a sense, we've estimated that as the current if the current proposal were to go into law, we estimate that it would be about a $20 billion a year market opportunity for our industry. So that's all back of the envelope kind of calculations. And it's not all new market. I'll just lay that out. Some of this is states are allowed to use some existing policies that are already in place to provide emission reductions, like an RPS or an ERS. So some of this is reinforcing existing markets, but some of it is also new market opportunity. So just to give you a sense of scale, you already saw this, so we can skip this. This is a Pennsylvania context, right? You've got a fairly traditional energy system here. So, and I'll say just, I noted the emission reduction target that you've got. And it's sort of middle of the pack in terms of the stringency. Now, you've also got a system that I mentioned there have been some challenges with the grid. The system in Pennsylvania is one of those places that has some challenges. In the last 3 years, the state's ranked in the top 10 in outages around the country. So there's a system that is sort of in need of some modernization in some ways, beyond just dealing with emissions. So that's a bit of the context for the state. And then, as Maureen was laying out with Act 129, the state's got some policy tools already in place that provide some emission reductions. It's got some more things to do to develop a full plan. But there are some pieces that are already on the books.